We will have to travel back 100 years in time to see one of the most amazing Christmas events of the 20th century. We believe it will be a journey that will be worth it. The year is 1914, and Europe has been struggling for almost 5 months in a war that will soon be called a world war. The landscape, disfigured by artillery fire, drinks the blood of hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and the continent is divided by hundreds of kilometers of trench lines. On the Western Front, trenches stretch from the North Sea to the Swiss border, and in them, the Germans on one side and the French and their British allies on the other have been suffering from the winter for weeks, and it is precisely the inhospitable trenches and the no-man's land lying between them that are to become the backdrop for seemingly insignificant situations, which, however, are in their essence one of the loudest cries about the meaninglessness of war that has ever sounded from the front battlefields. When the first Christmas of the war approached in December 1914, it was clear that the war, which had originally been expected to end by winter, would drag on for a very long time. Help to relieve the warring armies during the holidays came from various sides. For example, Pope Benedict XV asked the governments of the participating powers to silence their weapons, at least during Christmas night when the angels sing. However, even this modest proposal was officially rejected. At the same time, the rank-and-file soldiers on both sides did not feel nearly as much intolerance as the generals and their staffs. On many sections of the front, there were unwritten agreements that in the evening, when food was distributed, the firing would cease. And because the trenches were not far from each other, short-term unofficial truces could be agreed upon at times when it was necessary to get the wailing wounded back into the trenches and bury the dead. These were not frequent moments, but they did exist. However, what happened in some places on the Western Front on Christmas Day itself went far beyond all those small and creaky local truces, and it added further wrinkles to the generals on both sides. From the very beginning, they had viewed feelings of solidarity with the enemy and mutual understanding for shared suffering with great displeasure. In those few Christmas days in 1914, it was of no use to them for once. The soldiers in the trenches were used to singing in the evenings when the fire stopped. But on the evening of December 24th, at a time when Christmas Eve is celebrated in German-speaking countries, the British were surprised to hear completely different music on some Belgian battlefields. From the Prussian trenches, the familiar melody of the song Stille Nacht flowed towards them. That is the German version of the song Silent Night, which they themselves knew well and were going to sing it the next day. When Christmas is celebrated again with them, it was a beautiful but at the same time painful reminder of their loved ones who will spend the holidays without them this time, somewhere in the unattainable distance beyond the English Channel. On the German side, burning candles and small Christmas trees appeared first, and that evening and the next day, the British, at first hesitantly and then more boldly when they noticed similar movement in the enemy lines, entered no man's land, where they met men from the other side. Those who had been showering each other with grenades and machine gun fire for weeks suddenly stood face to face. They saw the same feelings, the same longing, and the same suffering. They began to show each other photos of their loved ones, exchanging food, tobacco, and alcohol, and also souvenirs such as buttons from uniforms. Later, entire legends began to be written about the football match between the Germans and the British held during this armistice. In reality, it was just a few spontaneous and largely improvised matches on different sections of the front. However, this does not change the main point. Tens of thousands of soldiers on both sides have discovered these days that there in the trenches opposite are people just like them, people who are not actually enemies. In the interest of objectivity, it should be noted that this unusual truce cannot be even remotely applied to the entire Western Front. Especially in the sectors held by the French and Belgians, Similar manifestations of solidarity occurred much less frequently. And on the Eastern Front, where the Austro-Hungarian and Russian units faced each other, events of this kind were a complete exception. Shortly after the holidays, information about the Christmas Truce on many sectors of the Western Front became public, mainly thanks to letters from soldiers that were first published by the American New York Times and some British newspapers. The articles were written in a spirit of complete understanding and lamentation that the mutual killing would continue. On the contrary, in Germany and France, thanks to strict wartime censorship, the response was either practically zero or limited to criticism of all those who sided with the enemy. But what was common everywhere? The general staffs of the participating armies decided that this was a very dangerous phenomenon. Understanding the enemy or even sympathy for them was the last thing they needed. Front commanders received orders that fraternizing with the enemy should be considered treason, and units that participated in the meeting with the opposing side were often transferred to other sections of the front. Propaganda on both sides began to do everything to completely drown out the momentary feeling of solidarity with the enemy. And for Christmas 1915, the generals on both sides planned a series of attacks and heavy artillery fire. So even if someone wanted to sing Christmas songs, no one on the other side would hear them. That's right. The First World War continued at its mad pace and will continue for another 3 years. And it will take with it 40 million dead and missing. But still, what happened in the very center of the fighting at the time of the First War Christmas remains to this day one of the most amazing and beautiful testimonies of human understanding in the midst of all the despair that we call the word war.